There we go.
Is it working? Are you seeing not my talking notes, but a lovely first slide?
We are seeing the first slide with the Intrepid
Awesome.
branding down the left-hand side. And
that's awesome. Yeah, I thought I'd do roughly. Make sure I use having Zina on the call. I thought I better don't fail on the brand.
So thank you. So just a little bit of background for anyone watching on catch up. So this is the Travel by B Corp meeting, November 2021, and Susanne, Etti, environmental impact specialist who's done the science-based target work for Intrepid Travel. Is that correct? The one that has recently been shared out with the industry, the tour operator industry, travel industry generally, to help encourage others to set SBTIs. Is that the correct?
Yep. And I will demystify it in a minute.
Thank you. So really, this is, I think there was a feeling in the group that there wasn't full clarity or understanding of the difference between, certainly this is true of me anyway, not full understanding of what's the difference between a target and a science-based target. Yep. And so Susanne has generously agreed to join us from Melbourne in Australia and explain to us what it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So let's get started. Woman Jacker, welcome. So as Tom said, my name is Susanne Etti, and I actually come from a very cold, dark place in Germany originally. So I'm very thankful at the moment to have traded freezing temperatures, snow, for the beautiful Buat Goro, which is the grass flowering season here. The days are actually warm and the rain comes in fits and bursts. And in fact, November is pretty crazy here, the weather, because it can be hot, stormy, wet, and full of pollen all at the same time. I'm calling in virtually today from Naarm, which is Melbourne here in Australia. And my connection to country is actually only 13 years. And I'm still exploring with curiosity how I can respectfully participate in the culture of this land. I hold very deep gratitude and respect for the traditional and continuing custodians who care for this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to offer respect to all our old people for it, as they brought us together. As the environmental impact specialist, I'm responsible for all our climate action work, and that includes our climate change performance. It is the reporting, but also advocacy work. And most of all, I'm working with the business to transition to a low carbon economy. And a tiny bit about me and my background. I was really interested in the natural world from a very young age. And as I grew older, I learned about human impact on the environment. And growing up in Germany, my family were all very passionate hikers and skiers. So I became aware of glaciers melting across Europe. I studied biology because I really thought that by understanding the ecosystem, but also the science of how things actually work, that would open up that door for me to create change. I'm a passionate advocate for the environment and sustainability. I'm a mentor in the Climate Reality Project that was founded by the US former Vice President Al Gore, and spend much of my free time actually in nature bushwalking. Having lived and worked in 6 countries, I believe by empowering local people through sustainable travel experience, we can really make travel better for everyone and simultaneously take care of our planet. So let's set the scene. I just wanted to come back to the IPCC report that was published back in August 2021, just a couple of months ago, that really placed total responsibility of human activity on rising temperatures. So without change, the Earth's surface temperature limit of 1.5 degree warming from pre-industrial levels will more likely than not be broken between 10 and 20 years from now. And this will move us a lot closer to an irreversible tipping point. So we have seen our consecutive hottest 5 years on record since 1850. Scientists tell us that 90% certainty that humans are influencing has driven the global retreat of glaciers since the 90s and the decrease in Arctic sea ice. But also scientists are almost certain that since 1950, the current weather and climate extreme, and so I mean the more frequency, but also intensity that we're seeing in every region across the globe, and that's including the heat waves that we just seen this past summer in Europe, in Greece, in North America, but also the floods in Germany and China and in the UK can all be attributed to human activity. We in the tourism industry are really at the forefront of the climate emergency. We have that front row seat to the crisis that is unfolding, and especially in many iconic natural areas and destinations across the globe. Just think the Barrier Reef here in Australia. So at the same time, before COVID hit, the sector contributed around 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So individually and also collectively as a global industry, we're definitely feeling the effects of the new extreme weather patterns and events. And with climate change, we could actually see that these tourism-dependent communities would be displaced and their livelihoods lost. And it also presents a growing risk and cost to all the travel business. So at the same time, tourism is one of those industries that are most severely impacted by COVID, and we really believe that this is the period will redefine tourism for the future. Obviously, COVID is not a solution to climate change, but I very much see it as a catalyst for more ambitious climate action to reduce emission and to transform our industry. And we also have to remember that there's hope. Scientists do believe we already have everything we need to avoid the impacts of a runaway climate change. But that everything depends really on solutions moving exponentially faster than impacts. And that's really where the science-based targets are coming in. The sooner business start working on those structural changes and emission trajectory in line with a 1.5 degree, and I want you to remember that's the crucial number, the more beneficial the changes to the business. So ambitious targets do not hinder business. Science-based greenhouse gas emission reduction targets help actually to drive innovation and real operational emission reductions. So just to set the scene, where our climate journey started off was actually back in 2005. So it's not like that we just recently became worried about climate change. In fact, our journey started back in 2005 when a group of senior managers read a book which is called The Weather Makers, and it's written by Tim Flannery, a paleontologist professor here in Australia. And the book is about the history, but also the future impacts of climate change. And that really started to get us thinking. It's really that epiphany in the business. Fast forward, and that involved also what I think is really important, gathering feedback from stakeholders, and that included our customers at the time too. And the message was very clear, like, do take definite action on climate. And so we actually became the world's largest carbon neutral travel company in 2010. And since then, we have offset, as of last year, 358,000 tons of carbon emissions worldwide. And we're definitely in the last 18 months, or maybe especially last 12 months, we're seeing many more companies now committing to carbon neutrality. And that's definitely great, but being carbon neutral is actually no longer enough with what I just had laid out with the report from the IPCC. So based on the facts we now know today, we would be actually lying to ourselves if we were just to continue as if there's nothing, as if carbon neutrality is actually enough for the travel industry. Just in our case, and that's true for everyone, over the last 15 years, the need for climate action has grown more obvious year on year. Not only is the climate crisis leading to more extreme weather events that threaten people and wildlife world over, but it's actually a significant threat to our business. So many of the destinations we actually love may well be destroyed by drought, fire, or other weather events over the next decades. So why am I saying carbon neutrality is not enough? So the graph here is showing you the explanation. So offsetting corporate emissions with carbon offset units is definitely a valuable climate action to date. But what is important here is that carbon offsetting relies on emission reductions that are not achieved, that are actually achieved elsewhere in compensation for the business as usual. You measure your carbon footprint on one hand, and then you basically balance those emissions with the equal amount of carbon offset units. The depth of structural change in the economy actually requires us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we really require everyone, and that's obviously countries, but it's cities, it's the private sector, and also individuals, to strengthen their action without delay and leaving really very little room to no room to outsource that climate action into the future. So the graph shows here demonstrates that even though carbon offsets compensate for the company business as usual, they alone do not result in actual emission reductions for the company over time, because the company hasn't actually set a reduction target. It just simply offsets the existing emissions each year. Another aspect to consider is that purchasing offsets are unlikely to remain a financially viable option, because actually most of the projections are foreseeing shortages of units in the market and really a steep increase in cost per units. So the message here is really the earlier business starts working on that structural change and emission trajectory in line with a 1.5 degree world, the less disruptive and the more beneficial those changes to the business practice will be. So what does actually an emission reduction target look like? So in line with climate projection and the explicit warnings from the scientific community to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that's the crucial number that is staying alive. Also post COP26, we're not going for well below 2 degrees. We need to aim for the 1.5 degree. So companies are increasingly actually expected to set emission reduction targets that are in line with climate science and really achieve those emission reductions in the company operation, but also in the wider value chain, so basically across your supply chain. And that really has to happen through meaningful actions, but also investment. What I think is really important here to mention is that carbon neutrality via the purchasing of carbon credit units, that means compensating for any of the unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions in its operation, will not be enough going forward, but those offsets can still play a role for the unavoidable emissions. And the important part is if you're using offset project, it is really important to ensure these projects deliver social, cultural, economic, and or environmental benefits, and also in the long run to really focus on the removal of carbon credits to neutralize residual emissions at net zero. And that's really looking at forestation projects, for instance, and not like at energy projects like wind or solar. So how did we get to our science-based target? I want to take you back in time for 2 years, which is pretty much 2 years ago, we started the conversation. And then in January 2020, we declared a climate emergency. And that was together with Tourism Declares, the collective of tourism business, organization, and individuals who we all have pledged urgent action on climate change. Our climate emergency is underpinned by a 7-point commitment plan. And that means that we're continuing to measure our emissions as we do since 2010. But we are also going 100% renewable in all our DMCs and sales offices. And we made a commitment to ambitious emission reduction targets through the Science Based Target Initiative. And in short, that's SBTI. And that means that we are setting a science-based target in line with 1.5 degree future, which meant we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions at the pace but also at the scale that science says is really necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees at the most across our operations and supply chains. Our climate emergency will continue also to empower women and strive for social justice and also sustainable growth around the world. Since the founding hours of Tourism Declares a climate emergency, we've grown to 400 plus signatories and counting organizations, companies and professionals, as we are working together to plan a better future for tourism. As I'm pretty sure all aware of, that the biggest climate advocacy piece to date was the launch of the Glasgow Declaration at Corp 26 in Glasgow. And that the Glasgow Declaration was developed with UNWTO, UNEP, Visit Scotland and Tourism Declares, the Travel Foundation, and is available now for everyone to sign. And I don't know how many of you on the call have been launch partners. But the declaration is really continuing what I just shared with you, is that commitment to cut tourism emissions to at least in half over the next decade and reach net zero emissions as soon as possible before 2050. And all signatories are also committing to deliver a climate action plan within the 12 months of signing and implementing them accordingly. And that's really also where, again, the science-based target comes in, and how do you meaningfully actually reduce your emissions by half by 2030. So Intrepid recognizes the benefits of climate action, in particular as the world's largest adventure travel company, taking customers to all 7 continents. And like all of us, we're sitting having that front seat to the climate disaster and the crisis and the extreme weather events that threaten the world tourist destinations and the communities. So as such, we have adopted a science-led approach and are actually the first global tour operator now with a verified carbon emission target that has been verified by the Science Based Target Initiative for 1.5 degree world. The Science Based Target Initiative is a collective of 4 key organizations, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, the World Resource Institute based in Washington, DC. It's the UN Global Compact and the known WWF. So in 2020, in a year that had very few highlights, we actually became the first global tour operator with a verified science-based target. And that meant really that this is now our next phase of our ongoing carbon journey. So we started to be carbon neutral in 2010, and now in 2020, we have a clear target to hold us accountable. And the science-based target really shows companies how much and how quickly business need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. And providing, I think that's a really important message to take away, is that clear pathway towards decarbonization, how to limit global warming. The targets, another I think is the second really important aspect, are actually independently assessed by the SBTi, that assesses those corporate emission reduction targets and ensures that they are ambitious enough and really in line of the 1.5 degree to meet the goals that the Paris Agreement set over 6 years ago. So before I go into our target, I just wanted to briefly talk about scopes, because that's very important for describing how we got to our science-based target. So let's start first of all that there are actually different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, when we're thinking of the office that some of you might be in today, in order to run an office, you have actually water usage in your kitchen, in your restroom, you have electricity to run the equipment, the server, there's waste being produced from landfill recycling to organic waste, but it's also around business flights, and in our case also pre-COVID, the printing of brochures. So the important part is that not all emissions are the same. So a company's greenhouse gas emissions are actually classified into 3 different scopes that you can see here on the screen now. And these are scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's really a way of categorizing the different kinds of carbon that I just described. And it's about describing the emissions that a company actually creates in its operations. So think about, in our case, in Intrepid, across our 23 plus offices, but also for our trips and the wider value chain. So with scope 1, this one covers the greenhouse gas emissions that a company makes directly. So that's all about running its boilers or vehicles, if it's actually asset heavy. Scope 2, these are the emissions it makes indirectly. So like when electricity or energy it buys for heating or cooling a building is being produced on its behalf. So it's all around purchasing electricity, for example. And then there's scope 3. Whoop, sorry, that was not the scope 3. Now that one is the tricky one. In this category go all the emissions associated not with the company itself, but actually with the organization is indirectly responsible for. And that can be up and down our value chain. So to give you an example, that can be, for example, from buying products from suppliers, or from products when customers use them. So that includes, for example, the business travel, it includes employee commuting. It's also, for example, if you're asset heavy, like in the case of Intrepid, the leasing of assets like cruise ships. It's about flights that are occurring within an itinerary, within a trip. But it's also transporting of goods. So for example, if you think accommodation, the outsourcing of laundry. So laundry associated emission can make actually a significant portion of a hotel's overall emissions. And in most cases, scope 3 is nearly always the big one out of those 3. So how does it look for us? And that slide will fill up slowly. So bear with me. I just walk you step by step through and really explain you how we have kind of developed our science-based target. So first of all, we have again our 3 scopes that I just explained. And selecting a science-based target approach, first of all, really requires the company's future business as usual greenhouse gas trajectory. So knowing how your business will be developing in the next 5 to 15 years. And an understanding of the emission hotspots in the inventory. So what are actually the main emission drivers and where can significant emission reduction initiatives be implemented to achieve the science-based target? You have basically a base year that you select, and then you take a target 5 to 15 years into the future. But you, as I said, you need also to understand where your emission reduction initiatives are in order to meet that target. And the right approach really depends on the company size, the business type, and the industry, where for certain sectors, there are actually methodologies available, which I'll come to in a minute. So our greenhouse gas inventory, we have developed that since 2010, and we do this on an annual calendar year. And it's consolidated on an operational control approach. So that means actually that our boundary that we are using is drawn by asking, what does Intrepid control or not control in its operations? And based on that answer to these questions, our greenhouse gas inventory boundary is actually drawn, and then we account for the subsequently the emission scope that 1, 2, and 3. So what you see now here is the percentage of the different scope in our overall carbon footprint. And what is important that under SBTi, a company must set a scope 1 and 2 target in line with climate science. And that's really also really important for the SMEs. But if a company's scope 3 emissions trigger the SBT scope 3 threshold, and that's basically happens when your scope 3 emissions constitute greater than 40% of the entire inventory. And as you can see, at 83%, we certainly triggered that and therefore had to set a Scope 3 target. But for example, SMEs have only to focus on Scope 1 and 2. But in our case, because of the size of our Scope 3 emissions, we also had to set a Scope 3 target. So let's look at where would be actually the emissions opportunity if we look at just Scope 1. So in order to reduce Scope 1, those direct emissions, we really have to reduce emissions from vehicle fuels. So those vehicles that we own by procuring either more fuel efficient vehicles, but also transition to hybrid and EV vehicles. And then there's also an aspect in some offices we are using natural gas from boilers or for heating. Looking at Scope 2, that was all around purchasing electricity. So the way we can reduce emissions here is really to move over to renewable energy. And Scope 3, that's the tricky one. It's the biggest chunk of our inventory, but also a lot is actually across our supply chain. But just to give you some ideas already where also our hotspots are, one is business travel. Pre-COVID, that was a big contributor of our office emissions, but also printing. And there you really look at transition to more brochures, more digital brochures. But it's also around purchasing services and goods. So that's all around the dollar spent on marketing, IT expenses, etc. And there it's really kind of working towards providers that have a lower carbon footprint. On our trips, we're looking at sold goods, and that's really around flight emissions within itineraries. So where can we take flights out of our itineraries to be more efficient and require less flights between destinations? And for example, cruise ships that we are leasing. So can we opt for suppliers that are more fuel efficient? So what I show you now, which fills the slide, the arrows are actually representing the official wording of our science-based target. So that's after 12 months of work and submitting our work and our target to the Science-Based Target Initiative. That was the wording that has been approved, and that's what we are using going forward. And I explain you that in parts. We start off on the left-hand side with the Scope 1 and 2. So at present, there is no sectoral decarbonization approach for the tourism travel sector. You might recall that I earlier said that there are methodologies out there, but unfortunately for tour operators, there is none. So for us, the only available option is actually to set an absolute Scope 1 and 2 target. And that target covers company-wide Scope 1 and 2 emissions as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. As I mentioned, the only option we had was an absolute target, and that ensures the overall reduction in companies' emissions. It's really easy to communicate to our stakeholders and also demonstrate strong ambitions as we are reducing 71% by 2035. So that's our target year. We have chosen one 15 years into the future, and the base year is 2018. And the reason is that in 2018, we changed our measurement methodology to be in line with the Australian carbon neutrality standard called Climate Active. And 2019 also showed a very good comparable year, so it made sense to start with 2018. Obviously, 2020 for all of us was being a total washout, so it would make no sense to use 2018 as your base year. The ambition that we used was obviously the 1.5 degree level. At the time when we applied for our target, we could have gone for the well below 2 degree. But what is important now that going forward from June 2022, the Science-Based Target Initiative will only accept 1.5 degree. And for us, it made sense because we also have a commitment to business ambition for 1.5 degree within the We Mean Business Coalition. And then you see now on the right in red, that's our Scope 3 target. So as I mentioned, under SBTi, we were required to set a science-based target for Scope 3 due to the size of our greenhouse gas inventory and the footprint size, and especially as Scope 3 contributes a significant portion of our entire inventory. And the target boundary for Scope 3 includes the majority of our value chain emissions. So for example, more than top 3 emission sources categories of, or alternatively, the 2/3 of total Scope 3 emissions. And again, that's all guidance being provided by the Science Based Target Initiative. And the target, as you can see, has been split between operations and also for our trips. And given the nature of our business and the industry we're in, we basically separated between the company product, the trip, and the company itself. And in both cases, we used a physical intensity target. So although it's less ambitious in overall emission reduction compared to an absolute Scope 3 target, a physical intensity target is much more suited for fast-growing companies, and that's therefore also more suited to Scope 3 for us in Intrepid Travel. So in the offices, the physical intensity target is based on full-time employees, and for our trips, the intensity metric is passenger per day. Few final points on the science-based target. You heard me earlier saying we're carbon neutral. We continue to be carbon neutral, meaning that we are offsetting our unavoidable emissions going forward or continuing going forward. But the use of offsets must not be counted as emission reduction towards the progress of the company's science-based target. So in order to achieve the 71% reduction in Scope 1 and 2, we have to actually reduce emissions. That's not where the carbon offsets are coming in. The SBTi requires companies to set this target really with direct action within their operation and their value chain. And as I said, the offsets can only be considered to be an option if you want to finance additional emission reductions beyond your science-based target. Or if you want, and that's the case for us, is to use it for the unavoidable emissions by purchasing then offset units. And we do it, continuing to do it from gold standard ECS projects, which have long-term focus. And in the long term, we actually want to focus more and more on nature-based solutions. There's a lot of information out there, and it's definitely for us been from the commitment to actually having an improved target has been an 18-month journey. What is important to remember, the Science-Based Target Initiative has a lot of resources for companies and also does really excellent webinars. So I really encourage you, if you're interested to find more out, visit their website to find out more. In the last couple of slides, I just wanted to talk to like, how do we actually get to 2035 and to ensuring we are meeting those targets? So here's an overview of some of the emission reduction initiatives that we are considering for our offices and our trips. May I just dive into the transport emissions, because they're amongst the biggest sources of greenhouse emissions in our emission profile. So we really need to see a transition away from fossil fuels, and that includes, for example, moving to hybrid and ultimately EV vehicles, but it's also around reducing flights across the business and our product. And this transition is really about reducing emissions, but also really important to providing customers with low carbon itineraries. If we think about Scope 2 emissions, so that was all around the purchased electricity, we aim to move all our DMC and CLs offices to 100% renewable by switching retailers and or purchasing renewable energy certificates. In the UK, and I think many of you are based in the UK, it's much more straightforward. You can, as an organization, that's what the Brixton office has done a couple of years ago already, is switching the retailer. But for example, our Canadian office, Toronto office, we had to purchase renewable energy certificates to ensure we can claim 100% renewable energy over there. Thinking of our product, so we are reviewing flights under 1.5 hours to replace where it's feasible. Alternative exists for its Intrepid's top 50 Intrepid trips by 2022. But also it's not about just removing flights, it's also bringing that carbon conscious recommendation in the product development so that we are developing low carbon products. So there's now best practice guide for sustainable consideration during the actual product development. And that's really to account for the carbon during the itinerary design stage to guide decisions based on carbon intensity, say of travel modes and activities. And what you see here, that's really kind of two product examples. For our product, as I said, we are reviewing the flights under the 1.5 hours, and we traded already, like the example on the left-hand side, internal flights with high-speed rail on the majority of our trips in China, and continue to make very similar changes elsewhere where we can. On the right-hand side, we switched in Cambodia, internal flight, actually with a river cruise to get people from Siem Reap to Phnom Penh. And to date, we have already removed 4 flight routes, and that actually represents around 3,000 flights from our products in 2022. So, in closing, I'm currently reading a book, Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, and that was edited by Anita Heiss. And I like to recite from the extract called Dear Australia by Don Bemrose. He's a Gungari man and an Australia's foremost male Aboriginal classical opera singer. Quote, I truly love every square inch Australia. I look forward to when we realize that this country is our giver of life and will survive long after we have passed on. Maybe then we will each choose a life similar to that of our ancestors, one of leaving soft footprints and a light touch on this landscape, and with a kindness for each other. Quote end. The future for the climate crisis and its solution is yet to be determined for us. Together, we can drive really ambitious climate action to secure a safe and healthy planet for all. So let's go to work. Thank you.